Recalling Simon, Chapter 1. I met myself last night. That is to say my guest, rushed in through the double doors which had served as the final bastion against the storm raging with fury outside. Previous to this encounter, it was not at all customary to receive visitors at the dead of night, under such circumstances. Indeed, I cannot recall ever having seen such a night. My guest, or rather intruder, sat himself upon one of the stools which adorned the bar of the house. The expression carried by this soul bore every trace of a man who has lost everything in the world and now seeks only answers of his inexplicable misfortune. We sat in silence and allowed the storm beyond our haven to continue its horrid and pitiless ranting against gods and devils alike. Rain pelted the large windows of the room, and a pool of water lay upon the wooden floor left by my companion's waterlogged coat. The inhospitability of the weather mirrored my own weariness of the stranger, who bore so exactly the resemblance of the man who stared back at me every morning in the mirror as I washed. But this eerie doppelganger looked as if his own life had brought him very little else but evil. "I can offer you something to drink," I proffered. The words were barely out of my mouth when I observed a glass in the man's right hand and his head leaning back as he partook of one of the stronger beverages that the house had to offer. I admit I was taken aback by the sudden way in which my guest comforted himself without the usual pleasantries. I said nothing, though, since his manner suggested that all he required in that moment was silence, and I felt somewhat physically incapable of violating this wish. I watched with absolute stillness the quality and gesticulations of the man who sat so morosely in one corner. I saw him argue in muted mimes with himself about some happening or another. Far be it from me to intrude upon his desperation, I was keenly aware of the lateness of the hour. I was going to suggest that we retire for the night and that my guest could explain his predicament in the morning before leaving me again to my solitude. Strangely, however, the abruptness of the visit had expelled all tiredness from my mind, although I did suspect that fatigue was merely waiting for the perfect moment when it could once again gnaw at my brain. The wind howled outside, and I was unable to rid myself of the imagined scene of the window pane suddenly shattering and flying inwards in several deadly shards. Such was the ferocity of the tempest that I felt as if worlds themselves were colliding. "I see you have travelled a fair bit to get here. I did hear a hansom, but felt that my ears were playing tricks on me. Storms such as these can play with our imaginations, I suppose. I must say, when you appeared through the doors of this room rather than the front door, I was startled, to say the least. I rambled, keenly aware that my lack of confidence displayed itself through every nervous and cowardly syllable. It was no lie of mine to say I was surprised, for the house we currently inhabited was located at the centre of several moorlands, which prohibited anything but the most determined client. I know Karen must have been surprised to deliver you here, although I fancy no amount of wind and rain would have stopped him discussing ancient Italian poetry with you. The man has a remarkable memory for such things." I observed the man shivering, and criticised myself for my lack of awareness and social graces. Rushing over, I took his coat and placed it aside. The gentleman took the hint and moved his chair closer to the fire, although I appreciated through instinct that it was life which made this man quake, and not the coldness of the night. I spoke frequently now, as compelled as I had earlier been to maintain silence. Now I could barely keep my lips together long enough to finish any particular word, before they opened again, allowing more sounds to pour forth. The stranger in his navy blue waistcoat said nothing, but checked his fob watch every now and then, as if awaiting the cloaked figure of death himself. As I continued speaking, I tried to convince myself that despite appearances we were in fact two autonomous human beings. I was afraid at just how similar we were in appearance. We both had faces that seemed moulded for solemn perseveration. Faces that betrayed our intransigent need to think and reflect, even when action was required. Were it not for the effect of the man's life on his appearance, it would have been impossible to tell us apart. My beard was well trimmed, immaculate in its narcissism, but my companion's facial hair seemed as if it had not been tended to in several weeks. My spectacles were clean, without mark and free from blemish. I often removed a small handkerchief from my breast pocket and wiped any real or perceived stain away with absent mind. My doppelganger, however, was forced to stare at me through lenses which had seen better days. The nose pieces had captured a substantial amount of grime. A pang of pity for this devil overwhelmed me for the briefest moment, at his not having the time to tend to the most basic of self-grooming procedures before being tossed about by the violent whims of existence. It was my impression, given all of these observations, that I represented the more successful version of this man, and as such I vowed to myself that I would aid him in any way I could. This oath, sworn to nobody but myself, took the form that night of giving him a bed to sleep in, and the charity of not taking from him the bottle of vodka which had seemed to calm his inner arguments. Genuine Russian spirit in a bottle, that, my friend. That is filled with the tumult and the resolute strength of an entire nation. That is the revolution and seeds of terror and tragedy washed in Siberian chills. For a man to take to it as a baby to milk must mean that you are, I think, a man of tragic comedy. That is a common ground upon which we both meet, I should imagine. If there is any way in which you think I can assist you, you need but ask. I was rather pleased with my oratory, although I found with a little wounded pride that he said nothing, and his demeanour suggested to me that my companion found my speech rather uninspiring. My irritation grew slightly, though yet again I found myself unable to voice this gripe of mine. Refilling the tumbler, the stranger turned his steely gaze upon the room. I saw in his eyes the relief of a man who had finally come home after many years. The mirror situated over the fire reflected back the magnificent dancing shadows of the room. These dark phantoms appeared to be dancing in merry waves, a festivity which couldn't possibly be shared by the man who sat alone with his thoughts. I observed as he attempted to bury them in a fog with the use of drink. Lucidity is a terrible thing, he said at last in a hollowed and sad voice. I wouldn't worry about lucidity for too much longer, given the amount you insist on drinking this evening, I acknowledged. The man smiled and nodded at my words. Impossible for me to get drunk on this. I wish it were not so, but that is the truth. It was my turn to smile at the absurdity of my companion's words. Well, as long as you tried, I suppose one cannot do any more than that. This banal attempt of mine at humour provoked the man's passion, and he laughed sardonically. Nonsense! One could do much more than merely try. We can bleed, cry, and kill for what is rightfully ours. I nodded, alarmed at the vigour with which my double exclaimed these words. There are plenty who would agree with you. There are even more who send them off to do exactly that with the same arguments. Such things, though, are not the problem of the manor. Here we are isolated from such travesties of human nature. My companion shook his head in disagreement. I doubt this place is as secluded as you would like to imagine from the violence of human ignorance. I found myself inwardly scoffing at the remarks. My friend seemed detached from reality, and I went from scoffing to once again vowing to assist him in any small way that I could. You'll prepare me a room. I will sleep in here tonight, though, next to the fire. Tomorrow you'll give me the blueprint to the house. I will then be engaged upon a project which will determine the outcome of a man's life. The stranger uttered these words as casually as one might order from a menu. I was not only taken aback, but my irritation with his pompous demeanour deepened. That is quite the request, said I. When I offered assistance, I of course meant that you should stay the night, but beyond that I'm afraid it would be down to the master of the house, and since he is away, it is out of my control. I continued with resolute firmness, which was not in keeping with my character. In an uncertain future, I can only state with conviction that a man will die. And thus it is vitally important that you assist me, he responded. I was a little perturbed by this statement, but the man offered no time for me to respond before he continued, his voice speaking with a slight harshness mirrored perfectly the ferocity of the climate beyond the safety of the walls. What I have just said is not a threat, it is rather a statement of fact. Your master will understand and approve of my request. We are intimately acquainted, and he's given me permission to embark upon my assignment. I will repeat only once more. You will prepare me a room, and tomorrow, at the earliest hour, you will provide me a blueprint of the house. The man emphasized the word will each time that he spoke it. Feeling the familiar fatigue ebbing back into my soul, I questioned a man's claims of knowing my master, and yet I thought better than to press the issue, especially given the stony face of the man, lit only by the blazing fire. His anger subsided, and before I understood how, his face eased into the previous one of relief as a man recently returned home from his voyages. You will forgive my reluctance at taking your word for it. I mean, with no offence intended, that you hardly look like a man of worthy repute, I said, attempting to be as diplomatic as possible. The man smiled and tipped the remainder of his drink into his throat before pouring yet another. You would look like me too, if you had seen the things I had seen, smelled and touched what I have had to. Consider yourself lucky, groundskeeper, that your home here shelters you from the winds beyond. Thank your God that in here the devil is easily contained. I moved towards the counter and poured myself a glass of water. I had no desire to lose my senses with drink when this man threatened to undermine my very existence with nonchalance. Aside from a complete disregard for the customary rules of social engagement, the stranger behaved with every gesture and movement as if the manor were the merest plaything created for his sole benefit. I toyed several times with the idea of giving him a speech of my own. I wanted to describe the genius of the manor, wanted to describe in detail what it was, but the night was far too tiresome, and so I acquiesced to suffer the indignities, at least temporarily. I think it would be best if I left you now. There is a good deal to be getting on with tomorrow, and I should retire if I am to satisfy your demands in the morning. The man did not reply. Instead, he chose to listen to the winds, which continued bellowing. I can bring you some sheets and bedding, if you are to sleep in here this evening, or if you would reconsider, I can easily set you up in one of the bedrooms upstairs, I continued. The man's gaze first fell upon the room before returning to me in a rather cold and aloof fashion. No, I shan't reconsider. It is imperative that I sleep in here this evening. No bedding is needed. My only desire is that the fire remain lit, and that I not be disturbed. I nodded at the stranger's words and gestured in the direction of several tall bookshelves. They will keep you company. Whatever misfortune has fallen upon you, it knows you will find a much broader array of troubles to have fallen upon members of our sorry species. I often find, when I am at a loss for direction, that they centre me somewhat. Perhaps this evening you will find the answers you are looking for buried amongst the words of men and women who have faced far greater trials than we. The man rose and drew closer to me. The distance with which he closed in on my position was covered with such rapidity that I felt a stirring of fear assail my usually calm demeanour. Saying nothing, he peered into my eyes as if examining a laboratory specimen. I felt terrified in the face of this sudden inspection. Despite the scrutiny, I was determined, however, not to show my terror and face anything this man had to throw at me with confidence and fortitude. The stranger smiled after spending what seemed an age in quiet contemplation of my visage. His smile was infinitely worse than his frown. It was a grin shared by only the insane and the very wise. I appreciate your understanding, and although it could hardly have been otherwise, I wish to acknowledge that your presence here may be of some use yet. A somewhat backhanded compliment, no doubt, but still I felt as if some bridge had been built between us, and we could start the next morning afresh and free of disagreements. I nodded at the stranger's words and offered him a handshake. Not taking this offer, he turned away, causing me to question the sincerity of his remarks. I left the library and made my way in the direction of the stairs. If one supposed that the night would thus be one of quiet repose, he or she would be mistaken. I lay for some time, my head resting on my pillow in the dark, wondering what this man's visit might mean. Did he really know my master? And what was this project of which he spoke with passion? Such questions bore themselves deep into my brain, and ensured that I slept little. When I did drift into realms between the unconscious and the unconscious, I fancied that I could see him sat reading alone, the books contained in the room he inhabited. My sleep was uneasy, and my dreams were filled with my physog circling around in my brain as images bounced around in a kaleidoscope. I could just about taste upon my lips hints of the circumstances which could make a man lose within his expression all enthusiasm for the beauty of life. Recalling Simon is available now from Amazon.